The first game that we're going to be taking a look at is between the leader, Caruana, playing with the black pieces, versus Nazarbek Abdusattorov playing with the white pieces. Nazarbek, seeing the first game of Caruana against Alireza in the London, decides to go for the London himself. So the game starts with d4, knight f6, knight f3, e6, bishop f4. Firouzja preferred to play bishop f4 on the second move, and Nazarbek decides to go bishop f4 on the third move. And this time Fabi has a different response. In the first game he played with a b6 bishop b7 setup, and today he's going for some e6 bishop e7, followed by knight h5 kind of setup. White is just simply controlling the center, and both sides are finishing development, and white opts for a long castle setup. The idea is that essentially white wants to attack black king on the king side, whereas after the move a6, black is really showing their intentions, that they're preparing the move b5, even with the idea of sacrificing a pawn to open up the queen side and try to target the white king on the queen side. White goes king d1, and black is not afraid, sacrifices a pawn. White simply takes this pawn and calls the bluff of the black player, trying to claim at least the material advantage out of the opening. Here already players have spent quite a lot of time. Black has spent over an hour and white has spent over 30 minutes, so we can see that the position is actually very, very fresh out of the opening. White goes d5, trying to contest and maybe open up the d-file, and black recaptures, white takes, black takes, and then the knight jumps to d4. So this was the initial idea of the pawn push going to d5. Instead, white could have played other options as well, something like e4. This would have grabbed the center, but Nazarbek decided to play the move d5, which might be a slight inaccuracy, but it is definitely a move that was possible and was played. c5, black is attacking the knight on d4. The knight goes to c6, forking the bishop and the queen. Queen moves aside, and white takes the pawn on d5. White has potential ideas of sacrificing the exchange to further open up the king side in the future, so black doesn't want to allow any of that, so they capture the pawn. This opens up the h-file, which could potentially lead to an attack on the king side. Bishop goes to b7, the knight was pinned on c6, so that's why white had to take the knight on e7, queen takes e7, rook d1, temporarily or permanently sacrificing the exchange, and believing the compensation that the passed a-pawn as well as the control on the light squares would help white achieve some sort of dynamic play. So rook fba, a4, and in this position after rook b6, white goes the move e4, total domination on the light squares. All the files are basically either closed or semi-open, let's say, so black is not really able to go through, and therefore players just had a very quick repetition, and the game ended in a draw. Very short, very quick draw, a little complicated in the middle game, but at the end both sides were content with a draw, so they repeated the position and agreed to a draw. Okay, so the next game we're going to be looking at is going to be between Gukesh and Praggnanandhaa. Gukesh was the other leader of the tournament, and he's going up against his countryman Prag. The two talented Indian players are facing each other in this round. The game starts off with a Catalan opening, where both sides knew what they were doing out of the opening for the most part of the game. And to this point, everything was pretty standard for both sides, and black surprised white with this move e5. Here, Prag was definitely still in preparation, where Gukesh spent around 20 minutes to play his next move. The previous games that had this position continued with bishop c6, but in this position, Gukesh instead decides to play d takes e5. After knight takes e5, queen takes e5, couple of trades happened, and the black queen retreated to h6, and the white queen just started attacking the pieces on the queen side. White played the move knight d3, trying to go for knight c5, and utilize the pressure on the queen side created by the queen and the bishop on g2. After knight d5, white retreated the queen back to b2 and improved his pieces slowly, and we eventually got a position like this where black has the isolated queen pawn and white also has black had the isolated queen pawn, and white has this beautiful knight that can relocate itself and block the pawn, or go to f4, try to attack this pawn. So bishop went to e6. White basically had the draw in hand whenever he wants, because in these types of IQP positions, it is oftentimes white who's pressing, or the side that does not have the isolated pawn pressing, and black has to, in this position, try to hold. But that was not really what happened in the game. I think Gukesh had a lot of ambition in this game, trying to win the game and try to get onto the sole lead, so he started making some backward moves, a little artificial I would say, and pushing his pieces backwards, and as time started ticking down, the task in hand was not so easy anymore, because black was threatening to go rook a1 and cause some trouble on the king, so in this moment he played the move f3, just trying to get rid of the pawn and eventually try to hold queen and rook endgame down a pawn at least, or a rook endgame. So he lost his pawn because he sort of had to. The bishop on e4 was dominating the knight on e4, and offered the queen trade. Pragg declined and the time was ticking down. So at this point both players have less than 5 minutes, and technically speaking this should be an easy hold, but with less time on the clock. Eventually, Gukesh actually made a mistake, a huge error in fact, offering a queen trade in this position, which does lose the game after queen takes, rook takes, and the move rook f5, which was played in the game. So Pragg definitely took advantage of that, and both players with less than 1 minute on the clock were playing this pawn endgame, which is very difficult to figure things out at the moment. But in this position, black returned the favor by blundering with king f6. Instead, he should have played the move h5, asking white what he's going to do. If white goes h4 check, black would retreat the king back to g6. If king goes up to f4, then the king will go to f6. So let's look at this move. Let's say king goes to e3, and here black can play the move king back to g7, trying to force white to play the move king f4. If white were to play king f4, then king f6 comes, and now it doesn't really matter what white does. Let's say king goes back to f3, king to e5, king to e3, f4 check, sacrificing a pawn, but this will be a temporary sacrifice, because in this position, after black goes f6, white has to give up the opposition, and the black king will simply go inside and win the pawn in this endgame. So there was a huge opportunity missed by Pragg. If the king were to go to f3, now in this position black can play this move f7 to f6. If the king goes to f4, black plays king here, the white king is forced to retreat. King goes to f7, now the king is coming from the other side, and we will see a very similar theme as we have seen before here. Black goes king to e7, keeping the long opposition or distant opposition. If the king ever were to go to f4, now king goes to e6, the white king is pushed back, king e5, king goes there, and now we see the same idea that we have seen before with f4. And if you take, I go here, this is a win. If you were to play king f3 in this position, black has to go here, here, check, takes, and now not king f5, as that would result in a draw after king f3, but instead king goes to d5, keeping the opposition on this side after the move f5, and the black king will sooner or later enter the e4 square. If king goes there, king c4, king here, king here, king here, king there, and the pawn is dropping, and the game would be won for black. Unfortunately, black missed this opportunity in time trouble. He played the move king f6 after spending some time, but after king f4, this game went on to being a draw, as Gukesh actually demonstrated a very good hold at that moment. After Pragg tried and even managed to get his king to the other side, white holds the opposition, and eventually the pawns were traded and the game ended in a draw. What a fighting game, which resulted in a draw at the end. Our next matchup is going to be between NVL and Alireza Firouzja. This game also ended in a draw, but it was also a very exciting one. So let's go right into the action. E4, E5, knight F3, knight C6, and we see a Berlin, which is very typical at the very high level. We see the immediate queen trade, and H3 was played by white. Rook D1, bishop E7, both sides are developing their pieces, and this is a very common theory. Therefore, the players are playing with extreme speed. Both sides have basically more time than they started, and this was the first big thing of the game. MBL spent around 20 minutes to play the move bishop G5. Alireza still very knowledgeable about the position, blitzing out everything. Up until this move where he plays Rook B6, and this is where he spent most of his time. So that's already 20 moves of preparation from black. Position is roughly equal, and both sides have nothing to complain. Indeed, black has a very decent position until he played this extremely creative move bishop to A2. Perhaps he is hoping for a blunder from the white side, but that did not happen. King went to F4, and Firouzja went a little bit greedy. He played the move rook takes B2, trying to just win the game, but he overlooked a beautiful move by white, which was spotted by MVL, and that was C4. Rook takes D2, knight takes D2, and now this bishop is kind of trapped. The next move is going to be rook to A1, so therefore black is forced to play A4. Rook went to A1, bishop to B3, and knight takes rook B1, and now white is completely winning in this position, because he simply will collect the pawn on F5 and has this beautiful pass pawn on the F file. White played bishop to G7, pawn went to C6, bishop went to E5, finding a better place in the center of the board, and now the pawn should start marching. After B5, this was the moment where white went wrong with the move C takes B5. Instead, he should have first played the move King G4, attacking this rook and letting the rook move away from the third rank, forcing it to go somewhere like H1, and then started pushing his pawn as further as it can go to try to get a new queen. Instead, after C takes B5, black played this very beautiful Zwischenzug in between move, attacking the rook, forcing white to go either somewhere on the B file or somewhere on the third rank, and he had to make a choice, and this is a very difficult choice. If the rook stays on the third, let's say something like rook C3, then after C B5, here black has enough counterplay because now he has his own pass pawn, and if he were to play rook B4, just like he did in the game, now he's losing his very important passed pawn on the F file. So after all of this happened, unfortunately, white had lost their advantage, and the game went on to becoming a draw in a rook endgame after some tries by white. They kept repeating, and the game ended in a draw peacefully. The next game we're going to be looking at is between Giri and Jan Nepomniachtchi. The game started off with knight F3, knight F6, G3, D5, bishop G2, E6, D4, and bishop E7 and C4. The Catalan opening as well. After castles, knight C3, DC4, knight E5, white is choosing this variation, which is a solid line for white to play against the Catalan, as opposed to the main lines that are traditional with castling. So the queens were off the board very early on. Knight C3, knight D4, bishop D2, bishop D7. White has some slight pressure, and both sides were playing relatively quickly, improving their pieces, trading couple pieces here and there. E4 grabbing the center, bishop B4, E takes F5, taking the knight, rook takes C4, couple trades, more trades, and more trades, so a lot of pieces came off the board. Knight d5, more pieces are traded, the rooks are active, and both sides just simplified the position, resulting in a draw in the rook endgame. So this game, neither side really had any opportunity. It was a very solid draw for both players, and after the repetition, both players just shaked hands. The final game that we're going to be looking at is going to be between Vachier-Lagrave and Deac Bogdan-Daniel. Vachier starts the game off with the move knight f3, g3, and bishop g2, playing a very solid position, and after the move c4, black decides to take on c4 after a decent think. Here, of course, black could have played the move c6, hoping for some symmetrical pawn structure after cd5. But of course, we had no idea what Vachier had prepared in this variation, so Deac, maybe he was slightly surprised by this choice, so he played d takes c4, knight a3, c5, and castles, and he spent around 20 minutes in this position. So Deac has been spending a lot of time throughout the tournament, and he's doing something similar. So Vachier probably was able to surprise his opponent right out of the opening and managed to get a very, very playable position with the white pieces. Knight d4, offering some trades. A lot of pieces were traded, and after long castles, black is ready to capture this pawn. Knight takes c4, knight takes c5, and black has definitely equalized in this position with no risk. So king goes to b8, utilizing some tactics. If you take the knight, this would not be good, since there is a check on d1, and after the bishop blocks, bishop goes h3, and the checkmate is unstoppable. So that would be a big blunder, and of course was not played by Vachier. He played the move b3 instead. Knight dropped back to a6 with the potential idea of jumping to b4. Therefore, white played the move a3, preventing that. Black plays the move bishop d5, offering the trade of the bishops, to which white replies by pinning the bishop to the rook, and black defends his bishop with knight c7. f4, king c8, guarding the rook, e4, pawn to b6, offering to take the knight and the trade. Therefore, white took the bishop, black took the knight, rook went to c1. It's important to note that bishop h3 does not win the rook due to the pin, because here black has the move e7, e6, or even f7, f5. Both moves are possible, unpinning the rook. Rook c1 instead pins the knight. Rook goes to d6, rook goes to c5, defending the pawn, as well as attacking the pawn in a5, to which black just basically traded off the two pawns for the one pawn, getting enough counterplay for the against the white's king, and just asking if white wants the perpetual. If he played king f2, white did not want the perpetual, but had to give up the d5 pawn instead. And after more moves were played, the game ended in a draw, in a peaceful fashion. Well, they kept playing, but there was really no action happening until further. But even then, this rook endgame is going to be a very easy hold for black, and that's what happened. After this, they decided to repeat and make a draw. So we had some pretty exciting matchups, but they all eventually ended in a draw.
Thank you for watching the video. Don't forget to give us a like and subscribe.